Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to review this album from John Lennon and Yoko Ono, Double Fantasy. It's the one which came out in November 1980, shortly before John's death, and what I'm going to do is take you through some of the background and then what I felt when it first came out, and then in retrospect. So, just a bit of background. Lennon hadn't made an album for 5 years, since 1975, and got into the Beatles in 1978. So for the first 2 years of my being a Beatles fan, there was no Lennon material, all kinds of rumours about what he was doing, living a reclusive life, a la Howard Hughes or someone. And then, I remember it distinctly, in August 1980, we were on our way back from a family holiday in the Algarve, and on the plane I was reading an issue of Newsweek, and it said that John Lennon was making a comeback album. So you can imagine how thrilled I was, and the excitement mounted over the following couple of months as we heard a little bit more about the sessions, and some snippets from some interviews he'd been doing with Playboy appeared in the papers. And then we found out that it was going to be a joint album with Yoko Ono. And I have to say, at the time I was a bit disappointed. I was thinking, after 5 years, the least you can do is come out with just your songs. Why do you have to share it with Yoko? So I was a little bit disappointed. But having said that, there were 7 tracks from each of them, and I counted it up the other day, and 7 Lennon tracks last for about 25 minutes, so not too far short of a full album. In the olden days they used to last for about 35 minutes, so maybe a couple of songs short, 2 or 3 songs short, but anyway, that was a minor grumble. Obviously the main focus was on the excitement of Lennon's comeback, and we all huddled around the transistor radio on that October day when the new Lennon single was going to be played on Radio 1. It was a pretty shitty transistor radio we were listening to, so you couldn't hear the bass or anything like that, and I just remember thinking there's a few too many female backing vocals. But that track, Starting Over, soon became a favourite of mine, and it actually reached the top 10 in the UK, which was the first time in quite a while that Lennon had a top 10 single. For most of his solo career in the mid-70s, early 70s, his singles were not doing too well in England. So I think it had reached number 8, and I think it just slipped down to number 10 on Sunday, December the 7th, so it was a bit disappointing. So the album came out on November the 17th. This is my copy of it, in a frame, because it's signed by Yoko, who I was lucky enough to have dinner with in 1998. I remember where I bought it, the Berwick's record shop in Rugby. It was £5. Still got the sticker on the front cover. So this is a German pressing, which is slightly different back cover. It's got the songs written a little bit clearer, who writes them and stuff, and musician credits on this copy. So it came out on November the 17th. We were thrilled. We got it back. We listened to it, all of us fans. So I'll tell you what I thought at the time. I remember thinking that I'm Losing You, Watching the Wheels, and Woman were just top drawer Lennon songs, and the other ones were decent, if not brilliant. And I include Beautiful Boy in that. I was a little bit underwhelmed by that track at first. I didn't think it had such a strong melody. Subsequently I discovered on repeated hearings that it does actually have a nice melody and great bass line from Tony Levine. By the way, I want to mention the band, which is documented, by the way, in this book from Ken Sharp on the making of Double Fantasy. It's a superb band. Hand-picked by Jack Douglas by all accounts. So Andy Newmark on drums, who'd worked with all kinds of people. He'd toured with George. He'd worked with Steve Winwood, among others. and later worked with Roger Waters. And then Earl Slick on guitar, who'd worked with Bowie on Young Americans and Station to Station. Hugh McCracken, who'd worked on the Christmas single from John and Yoko in '71, and also, interestingly, was the guitarist on the Ram album from Paul McCartney. And I read that they did actually discuss that during the Double Fantasy sessions a little bit, anyway. George Small on keyboards, Arthur Jenkins on percussion. Just a great sounding band, and I'm not sure if I'd describe it as an 80s sound, because I don't think the 80s sound of a lot of bands was my favourite. The drums being a little bit too heavy, but this was certainly a modern sound when it first came out in 1980. Very well produced by Jack Douglas, very well produced, and or co-produced with John and Yoko. So I'm not going to go through the songs track by track, but I will say that Yoko's tracks are some of the most successful stuff of her career, and enjoyable, I'd say, as well. Particularly fond of Kiss Kiss Kiss, the B-side of the Starting Over single, and I'm Moving On. Those two tracks are pretty much classic Yoko, along with Walking on Thin Ice, which came out shortly after John died. Her other songs are, not bad. It's certainly more mainstream and not commercial, but actually with an edge to them, probably more than the Lennon stuff, which was maybe a little bit safe in terms of style. The Starting Over single, very much a 50s rocker, but having said that, great sound. And actually, the version on this album, which came out in 2010, which is the stripped down version of Double Fantasy, there's some great pictures. Yeah. The sound they get without the production is just brilliant, particularly on Starting Over. The bass is more emphasised and Lennon's vocal is higher in the mix. One thing Lennon used to do a little bit too much was downplay his vocals, turn them down in the mix. Whereas on the stripped down version you can hear them a lot clearer. So Watching the Wheels, which opens side 2, is just in Lennon's top 5 solo songs, I believe. It's a really gorgeous piano ballad. The demo of which Lennon, I think, is playing piano on, and then the finished version, George Small is probably playing because it contains all those fiddly bits and stuff. Just a brilliant production, brilliant sound, and literally in my top 5 Lennon songs. And the other absolute classic on this album is Woman, which was written for Yoko, but for all women, to recognise the contribution of women in general. And he was very eloquent about this song in the Andy Peebles interview on December 6th, 1980. So we had 3 weeks to enjoy these new songs. Did I mention I'm Losing You? Brilliant track. The closest Lennon comes to his old angst type stuff from the Plastic Ono Band album. Brilliant guitar solo from Earl Slick. Cheap Trick actually did a version of this with Lennon in the studio during the sessions, which didn't make it to the final album. But it was the Cheap Trick guitarist and drummer, I believe, with Tony Levine on bass, and that is available on the Lennon Anthology, and it's a very welcome alternative version. I think they both have their merits. I actually love the band version on here. Probably a little bit more than the Cheap Trick version, but they're both very worthy. Dear Yoko is a catchy Lennon track. Play It Loud, great bass, great groove, and clean-up time is decent. I didn't rate it too highly at the time, but I think in retrospect, and again on this album, the mix is brilliant, and it really rocks along a bit harder than it does on the album. So anyway, after 3 weeks of having this album and enjoying it, then Lennon was killed, and I was at boarding school at the time. I was woken up on that Tuesday morning by no less than 3 people who told me the news, and just speechless. And I remember going to morning chapel, and I think I had some exams that day. I think I had an economics exam and a religious studies exam. And I seem to remember I got 13% in the economics exam, which may have been a combination of what happened to John and also I probably wasn't too keen on economics at the time. Anyway, I'm not going to mention the name of the guy who killed him. He did it for all the wrong reasons, to try and become famous. He's been described by Paul McCartney as the jerk of all jerks, by George Harrison as the devil's best friend. I can think of even worse things to say about him. I'm still angry to this day, 35 years later. It's a completely senseless crime, and I can only imagine what we would have had from Lennon had he lived, because he was really on the top of his game with the interviews he made. Around the time of this album's release, you could tell he was just raring to go, and he had the second album planned, and he was going to tour, by all accounts, with this band, come to England. So we would have had all of that to look forward to, but it was robbed from us by this jerk of all jerks. So a few years later, Milk and Honey came out, which was supposed to kind of approximate what the sequel would have looked like, but actually the problem with that album is the Lennon tracks are not fully produced, and a couple of them probably wouldn't have made the cut had he lived, like Forgive Me, My Little Flower is not a great number. Borrowed Time, the reggae track, is again, it's underproduced and quite a raw version. It's got its moments, but two complete classics on Milk and Honey and Nobody Told Me, which is absolutely brilliant, classic, vintage, humorous Lennon, and I Don't Want to Face It. Those two are brilliant. Stepping Out, not quite up to the mark in my opinion, but anyway, that he would have done whatever with those tracks, made them better, put some production on it, worked out some arrangements. Forgot to mention Grow Old Along With Me, which was in a very rough demo form on Milk and Honey, and it was recorded in November 1980. He would have gone back to that song. He had big plans for it, big production number. He was planning for this song to be the kind of song that could be played at weddings, and actually it was played at my wedding. I chose it specially in 1998, the same year that I met Yoko. So that's my feelings about Double Fantasy. I think Lennon's work is up there with his best for the most part, and I'm sure it would have been the start of some incredible stuff to come. And on bootlegs there's other tracks like Serve Yourself, hilarious parody of Bob Dylan's Gotta Serve Somebody, which is also shows that he had humour and he had another side to him, whereas on this album a lot of the tracks are quite kind of romantic and a little bit slushy. But he said, he was a bit embarrassed by the track Woman because he's supposed to be tough Lennon with the leather jacket, and he really is just as romantic as the next guy. So he was very honest on this album, but it kind of displayed the more sentimental side of his nature, and we would have seen the other side or sides come out in future albums, I'm sure. So, great picture on the back, standing outside the Dakota where John died, taken in the summer of 1980. So, I hope it wasn't too long. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.